After the breakaway success of Turok, Dinosaur Hunter in 1997, Iguana Entertainment was quick to capitalize on the series, to strike while the iron is hot, as some may put it. Actually, more accurately, they struck before the prior item was removed from the anvil, with development of Turok 2 beginning before the original even released. Turok 2 managed to release only a year and a half after the original and was a complete overhaul from the original game. Despite that quick turnaround time, the game they released did not falter, and by most was considered to be an improvement over the original in just about every way. The gameplay and graphics were vastly improved, story elements were strengthened considerably, and on release sold over 1 million copies. Even more impressive still was that the game released solely for the N64, a console usually not known for its more mature games. Today we're going to go back and see how this legendary console FPS holds up over 25 years later. As we already talked about, the development cycle for Seeds of Evil was fast and furious, with development starting before the original had even released. Iguana Entertainment had really put all their reptilian eggs in one basket with this franchise. Unlike the first game, this one made use of the Nintendo's expansion pack, allowing players to bring up the resolution in the game for a better graphical experience. This obviously has little bearing on anything today, but I feel compelled to keep it in the video because honestly, in what other part of my life will I ever be able to reminisce about Nintendo's expansion pack? That little chunk of plastic and microchips added a staggering 4 megabytes of RAM to the console, a 100% increase. For this video, I'll be playing through the Night Dive remaster of the game, as I did with the original. There are some notable differences between the remaster and the original. Most notably is that the original distance fog has been removed, allowing players to see the beautifully detailed world of the Lost Lands in their full glory. Additionally, the remaster added a hint system, which highlights quest objectives when they're nearby. Aside from that, and a few other quality of life improvements, the game is quite faithful to the source material. Turok 2 did boast improvements over the original not only in its graphical fidelity, but also in its varied environments. The original mostly had the player moving around in a jungle environment and very briefly onboard an alien spacecraft at the end. This next iteration in the series saw the player visit multiple dimensions, traveling to a new location with each level. There were only 6 total levels in the game, all attached to a single hub, but each level was unique and memorable in its own way, and a certain level is extremely memorable, though often not for a good reason. We will get to that later. One of the biggest changes from Turok 1 to Turok 2 is the greater emphasis on storytelling. Unlike the first game, where the entire story pretty well comes from the game manual, Turok 2 has story elements throughout and a much greater focus on building up the world of Turok. You no longer play as Tal Set in this iteration of the game. Instead, you play as Joshua Fireseed, the latest in a long line of Turoks. At the end of the last game, Tal Set had defeated the Campaigner, a warlord bent on conquering the Lost Lands. After his defeat, Tal Set was left holding a powerful and deadly weapon, the Chronoscepter. Not knowing what to do with it, he decides to toss it into a volcano to avoid it falling into the wrong hands. Unfortunately, the aftermath of the weapon's destruction awakened the Primogen, who we now must stop as Joshua. Now, I did some research into the Primogen for this video and actually learned a lot about his backstory that isn't really touched on in the video games. But if you're a fan of the series at all, some of this is actually really interesting. To summarize, the Primogen is a member of an extremely advanced race of aliens. His race had discovered all there was to know, but still hadn't unraveled where all life began. In his quest to discover the answer to this question, the Primogen created a time-traveling ship capable of moving through both time and the nether space, the space between our world and the Lost Lands. When his ship stopped, it caused all matter around him to collapse, ironically creating the Big Bang and the start of the universe he so desired to see created. Unfortunately for the Primogen, this event also knocked him back into nether space, and created a temporal prison, locking him away for all time. Well, almost all time until Talset messed it all up. The reason we need to stop the Primogen is that if he is able to fully reawaken the ship, it would likely destroy our reality just in its usage. I found this backstory super interesting for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, it explains, at least in a limited degree, how we're able to connect to all these other dimensions on our quest. The Primogen's tomfoolery with the timeline created holes in nether space, allowing us to travel between those dimensions. Also, on a more philosophical level, it seems like the Primogen may have somehow created the universe. So really, the Primogen is God. Turok 2 is literally the quest to kill God, and we're gonna do it with a shotgun and a rocket launcher. Turok 2 improved the gameplay loop of the original in a lot of ways. You still hunt for keys, and the ultimate objective is to gather all the boss keys in order to gain access to the final confrontation with the Primogen. However, on top of this, they have also added mission objectives into each world you explore, adding a bit more variety and roleplay elements to the game. The levels on offer in Turok 2 are far more maze-like in design than the original more linear approach. You'll find yourself crisscrossing back through the same levels multiple times as you gain new powers and get access to new areas. You could revisit levels in the original as well, but there really wasn't much reason to unless you missed a piece of the Chronoscepter, which in itself was not actually mandatory to construct to complete the main campaign. Here, not only is backtracking recommended to find all the secrets the game has to offer, but it's mandatory if you want to access that final fight with the Primogen. This is where I think the game employs an almost Metroidvania style. Unlike a typical shooter, where you just need to go from A to B, here you'll be seeing areas outside your reach throughout, areas you'll only be able to reach later when you've learned new powers, such as long jumping or being able to swim in poison water. Some critics have dismissed this as pointless backtracking, and I'll be the first to admit, sometimes it is. But really, it does add a more interesting depth to the game than other shooters at the time had. You needed to keep your head on a swivel and make note of areas you would need to return to later. Overall, it just makes for a much more engaging experience than simply moving in one direction and shooting. One thing Turok 2 is remembered for is its vast array of interesting weaponry you can gather throughout your quest. You have weapons ranging from the mundane to the fantastic, a variety of both ranged and melee options, and even weapons solely designed for underwater use. There are so many weapons to choose from that there are some that I pretty well didn't use at all, despite them being interesting in concept. Weapons like the Shredder and Firestorm Cannon were responsible for the bulk of my killing, whereas gimmick weapons like the Tranquilizer Rifle and Charge Dart Gun saw practically no use. I can't fathom why I would want to stun my enemies when there are so many options to kill them. Like the first game, you can slowly build an ultimate weapon throughout the campaign, assembling the 6 pieces to create the Nuke. This weapon is a nostalgic callback to collecting the Chronoscepter in the original, but honestly saw nearly zero usage from me. Unlike its predecessor, the Nuke cannot harm boss enemies, and you assemble it so near to the end of the game that it's likely all that will be left will be the boss enemies. Literally the only time I used it was to kill drones in the Primogen fight, but even then, it felt like a bit of a waste. Building it is fun though, mostly for story reasons I'll go into during the story segment of this video. The last weapon I have to shout out is the Cerebral Boar. I think legally, you cannot create content on this game without mentioning it. The weapon is famous in the FPS world, and essentially shoots a homing robot into the skull of your enemy. The robot latches on, drills their brains out, then explodes. Now, I do feel the need to mention that a projectile that simply attached to an enemy's head and exploded would be more than enough to kill anything we encounter in our quest, but I guess the gratuitous violence is all part of being a Turok. On top of the new weapons, the shooting mechanics were vastly improved from the original, enemies now having location-based damage as a staple in their design. Generally, headshots were your best bet to take enemies down quick, but you can also shoot off limbs and even blow a hole clean through your enemies in some cases. Considering how many different enemy varieties this game had, it's amazing to see how much effort went into giving them all unique death animations. The last thing this game vastly improved over the original was its story, and instead of wasting more time talking about it here, let's get into it now. The game kicks off with our hero, Turok, rolling through a portal to find himself face to face with Adon. Without going crazy in-depth with the lore, she is a speaker for the leaders of the Lost Land, who themselves only exist in a disembodied state. She acts as our guide in the Lost Lands, and in our meeting here explains the threat of the Primogen. She explains that now that the Primogen is awake, the only thing keeping him entombed in the wreckage of his lightship are 5 energy totems spread throughout 5 different lands. Our mission will be to protect these totems at all costs, for even one being destroyed would be enough to release the Primogen and destroy our universe. She wastes no time sending us out to our first of many worlds in need of saving, the port of Adia. This area comprises of a coastal village under attack by mutant dinosaur humanoids called the Dinosaurs. These creatures do the Primogen's bidding, but want more than anything else to see humanity wiped from existence. They're kind of asshats, and are our most common enemy in the game. The game dumps us right onto the docks to start our foray into the city. Our objectives here are to light the distress beacons and free some captured children. And of course, to find the energy totem, and defend it at all costs.
Locate the energy totem, and defend it at all costs.
Moving away from the docks, we're attacked by our first enemy, and we get to see the importance of headshots as I learn to aim. I think that's 8 arrows to kill this guy. A headshot would have killed him in 2. Aim is important here, and this remains true throughout the game. How I managed to play this on the frankly wildly inaccurate N64 controller back in the day is a mystery to me. Young me was better at games, I guess. The platforming has been heavily scaled back in this entry in the series, but a little bit of jumping here at the start will net us a pistol a bit early. If you're feeling vertically challenged, it appears again in a few rooms. Sadly, there is no dual wielding. Caleb would be devastated. Moving through this level, we get to see the best the game has to offer. You snake through half-destroyed buildings and tunnels, emerging onto the streets above to witness the chaos of the city. The sounds of gunfire and screams on the air. We travel high to activate the many signal towers, and delve into darkened buildings to rescue the children being used as bait for Turok, or worse. Of all the worlds we'll explore throughout this playthrough, none feel so alive to me as the Port of Adia. Before we reach the energy totem, we come across a warp portal. Generally, these warp portals are used to grant us access to new powers and abilities, but stepping into this one, we're greeted by a far less friendly scene. We're in a world of ugly machinery and sound. Bloodied hooks and chain hang from the ceiling, a clear sign of the pain that has been inflicted in this place. A haunting chorus of voices taunts us, lets us know the Primogen can't be stopped, and that our failure is inevitable. We truly know nothing about these mysterious creatures, aside from them identifying themselves as the Shadow of Oblivion. Even more concerning is that Adon also knows literally nothing about them. The speaker for what are essentially the demigod rulers of the Lost Lands doesn't have a clue who these beings are. Regardless, they are hostile, so we need to do what Turoks do best. Destroy them with unmitigated violence. Victory here buys us a ticket to freedom, and more importantly, 1/6 of the nuke weapon. There's one of these false portals in each realm of the Lost Lands, and while they are optional, you will need to clear each if you want to claim the ultimate nuke weapon. Back in the port, it's time to defend the energy totem. Each of the first 5 levels end this way, and starting at the halfway point, they also feature bosses to destroy. We repel the invasion and are transported to the hub, a place seemingly between dimensions where we can rest and recuperate between missions. Here is where we can select our next adventure, unlock doors, and even catch up with Adon should the mood strike. On to level 2, the River of Souls, another standout level in the game. Turok really front loads its memorable moments. Here we start the level outside a pen of a Triceratops. A Triceratops mounted with grenade launchers and a machine gun. We hop on and get Turok 2's only vehicle section. This is a fairly short portion of the game, but a memorable one. The section sees you moving through the ruins of a destroyed city, laying waste to the dinosaur invaders. There are lots of nice touches here, including destructible buildings and a secret that can only be opened by destroying the 4 towers seen on the horizon. Moving past the vehicle section, this level is where you will start to take mental notes of places you'll want to revisit later. The waters here are poisoned. Even touching a toe in them will instantly kill you. There are icons on the ground indicating that you can traverse the water here, but don't yet have access to that power. Moving through the level, we have two basic objectives. Destroy the soul gates, allowing the undead to be raised within the city, and slay the three Sisters of Despair. Both of these objectives act as mini boss fights, with you focusing on taking out the summoner, or portal, while keeping undead numbers down to prevent becoming overwhelmed. These provided just the right amount of challenge to be engaging and memorable, and I have to give a quick shout out to the Soul Gate design. Even this many years on, the way they're portrayed is stuck out in my mind. Objectives complete, we gain the long jump power. We claim another nuke piece, defend another totem, and are on our way to the Death Marshes. The Death Marshes are another great level, if a bit more bleak than the last two. Here, we are no longer defending a settlement under attack, but instead invading the home of one of the Primogen's allies, the Perlin. The Perlin are ogre-like creatures with a primitive society that once again have a pretty strong hate-on for humanity. Don't know why, but any excuse to kill these budget Shreks is fine by me. They have been outfitted with advanced weaponry by the Primogen, so our biggest objective here is to destroy their munition reserves. These segments are a fun time. The munitions are stored in large cave complexes, and we'll need to attach explosive satchels onto the main stockpile and run away as the entire place explodes behind us, channeling that Tal-Set energy from Turok 1. This level sees us interacting a lot more with the wildlife than in previous levels. Between wasp nests and underwater tremor creatures, you need to stay on your toes to keep from becoming lunch here. Notably, we also pick up the Breath of Life talisman here, allowing us to traverse not only the poison waters of the swamp, but those of other areas as well. Next up, Lair of the Blind Ones. This is probably the most well-remembered level in Turok, and generally not remembered for good reason. This level has only one objective: to seal the 3 vent shafts, trapping the Blind Ones in their underground lairs. Seems simple enough, but it's far from it. The level is a mass of similar-looking corridors, falling rock traps, and switch hunts galore. There are even switches that need to be shot from a distance, and a new player would be hard-pressed to know this without the newly added objective markers. To worsen things, multiple sections of this map are completely underwater, and sealing the vents is not as straightforward as it would seem. You not only need to find the vents themselves, which is no small feat in this maze, but you also need to find an explosive satchel for each. This is my first playthrough of Turok 2 in about 5 years, but I would say all in all, I've beaten this game about 5 or 6 times. Despite my veteran status with the game, this level took me just shy of 2 hours to complete. Any other level in this game only took about half that time. All that said, I don't hate this level. Despite its confusing nature, it does have some interesting and memorable set pieces. And the Blind Ones themselves are creepy antagonists for the act. Strangely enough, the Blind Ones are also the only enemy in the game that doesn't seem to be directly working for the Primogen, or at least it isn't stated directly in their introductory cutscene. They're sort of just dicks that like to abduct and kill people in their underground lairs. Anyway, after the energy totem battle, we get our first boss encounter, and it's pretty enjoyable, if a little bit illogical. The boss here is a giant eyeball. You stand on a platform under it, killing its minions until the eye opens, then shoot the eye. Pretty basic stuff, but I was more distracted by the actual boss being an eye. Like, presumably the Blind Ones are blind because they live in darkened tunnels and have no need for sight, but their god figure is just a huge eye. A huge eye also living in an environment where sight really wouldn't be required. I'm probably just overthinking this. Big eye equals scary cool boss is probably all the logic that really went into this. That's fine. Next up, Hive of the Mantids. Adon says the Mantids are incapable of pity, remorse, or kindness, and exist solely to further their own existence. Sounds like a hive of politicians to me. Please laugh at my adults-only joke. Anyhow, this is a hive, but it's a future hive with computers and technology. So our mission here is to destroy the supercomputer, sending these bugs back to the Stone Age where they belong. Despite the prior level usually being remembered as the worst in the game, I would for sure argue that this level is significantly worse. To me, this level is just as confusing as the Lair of the Blind Ones, but added in is the annoyance of having to actually fight the Mantids. They move very quickly and have difficult hitboxes, making landing headshots more an exercise in luck than in skill. The level itself is not my cup of tea aesthetically either. It's very purpley blue and green neon colors, and just isn't great to look at. Like the last level, this one ends in a boss fight as well. Not as interesting as the prior boss, here we are fighting a warrior bug type thing. It's a pretty straightforward fight. You shoot its limbs until they fall off, and eventually, once all its limbs are gone, we cut its head off with our warblade. Kind of a sad sight, but honestly, bugs shouldn't have human-looking teeth, so I have no regrets. Last level, the Primogen's Lightship. Our goal here is to stop the assembly of the Primogen's cybernetic army. I guess this guy has a failsafe here that if he's killed, the ship will release an army of these hostile cyborgs out into the world to get revenge on the Lost Lands. Like, what an absolute ass. This guy crashes his car into the side of our galaxy, then acts like we're the bad guys for, wanting to not have our universe vaporized by his highly unstable time machine. Anyhow, this level is much more enjoyable than the last one, and a good send-off for the game. This may just be because I've played through this so many times now, but I don't find this level nearly as maze-like and confusing as the last two. Everything is fairly straightforward. You clear through 4 distinct quadrants of the ship, unlocking doors as you go. Notably, we find the final Oblivion warp gate here, and get another talking to by our favorite Void Fiends. I don't want to go overboard on the hype train here, but these scenes with the Servants of Oblivion are some of the most memorable of the game. They have stuck with me even to this day as some of the best foreshadowing and sequel baiting in video game history.
Your victory! Your failure! Order or chaos! They all fuel the unquenchable fire of Oblivion. Accept the inevitable.
As much as the Primogen is a real threat, these guys give the impression that they are who we should really be worried about. Just really good stuff. We finish building our nuke weapon, but won't actually use it until the final fight. Finishing up the light ship, the game suspiciously gives us full ammunition for every weapon, and at the end of a long corridor we find the final portal. Unlike in the previous levels, there is no totem to defend here. Instead, we find ourselves in the bowels of the ship, and face to face with the monstrosity that is the Mother. I'm not certain if this is ever explicitly stated, but it is believed that this creature, true to its namesake, is the mother of the Oblivion spawn creatures we've been fighting in our search for the nuke. The fight itself is probably my favorite in the game. She has multiple phases where you'll be blowing off her limbs. Each time you do, she regrows them and her attack patterns change. Finally, she enters her final arachnid form, and you need to focus on headshots to finish the fight. Worth noting here, when she hits 0 HP, she doesn't die, instead fleeing into the darkness. She is the only boss we never see the end to, and honestly has me curious to read the comics to see if there's an end to her storyline outside the games. With her defeated, we are finally prepared to enter the central portal in the hub and face down the Primogen once and for all. So, the Primogen fight. This is what it's all been leading up to, right? So this should be a good and satisfying end to the game. Unfortunately, this is not the case. This fight, to me, is the lowest point of the entire game. Just like in the prior iteration, the penultimate boss proved to be much more engaging than the finale. In Turok 1, the campaigner was a bit of a letdown just due to the ease of the fight, especially after having fought a T-Rex boss prior. Here, we have the opposite problem with the Primogen. The idea for the fight isn't inherently bad. You go through phases where the Primogen will be in a glass box, beyond harm, he'll send drones and bombs to try and kill you, and eventually come to fight you directly. Once he's on the ground, similar to the prior fight with the Mother, you'll need to carve pieces off him to transition him back into his safety box. The problem is, this goes on for so unbelievably long. You have to transition in between these phases probably 10 times before his head becomes vulnerable. And even then, if you don't kill him fast enough, he just heals and you have to start all over again. To top it all off, there is respawning ammo, but only for the Firestorm Cannon, shotgun, and pistol. So you have this huge arsenal of weapons you've assembled and are pretty well locked out of using them the majority of the fight. I even use the nuke weapon here and find it sadly lacking, and 5 shots later, it's out of my roster for good. I did kill the Primogen on my first attempt, but all in all, my recording of the fight was over 30 minutes. That is far too long and drawn out for an FPS fight in an action-heavy game. Anyhow, it's a bit of a disappointing end gameplay-wise, but once we do kill the giant bug, we get treated to a cutscene of all the energy totems firing together to turn him into a smudge on the ground. Could the totems do that the whole time? Could we not have just killed him with a remote strike and avoided this whole confrontation in the first place? Ah well, Adon congratulates us and gives us a little bit more foreshadowing on the Oblivion creatures, but that is a mystery that will have to wait until the next game. This first review comes from Steam. You're going to need a guide for locations of keys, prime keys, secrets, a guide. You're going to need to follow the guide exactly as shown, step by step. If you don't, you'll wander aimlessly, forever. I'm including this review because generally the topic of about 90% of the negative reviews on this game is this exactly. The people that dislike Turok 2 generally seem to dislike it because it is non-linear. And I can understand someone taking that view, especially coming from Turok 1, where the experience was more your typical linear shooter affair. I think the reason people have trouble with the more complex levels in Turok 2 is because they're coming into it thinking it's your standard FPS, where the only thing you need to think about is killing the next enemy on the screen. And that's cool. I like that sort of game experience as well, but Turok 2 was never aiming to be that. It's something a bit more unique, a bit more nuanced. At its core, sure, Turok is about cool weapons and vicious combat, but beneath that, it's also about exploration and discovery. The game wants you to wander a bit in its game world. They want you to really get to know the beautiful environments they've crafted for you to explore. This is a game sprawling over dimensions, and yes, on a first playthrough you're going to get a bit lost when you learn a new power and can't quite remember where there was to use it. Or when you're missing that one Primogen key and just can't quite remember if this is the map you missed it on. But I think this is what made the game so memorable and unique at the time. I also think people forget, or just don't realize, that Turok is a universe with a lot of lore, and this is the first entry in the series where they're trying to bring more of that world to life. I can totally sympathize with someone feeling ripped off with less action here than in the original, but would also ask that that same person come back to this when they're feeling more patient, as there's just so much to love. Next review comes from Metacritic. After the very enjoyable Turok Dinosaur Hunter, the first outing in the series, Turok 2 has officially killed what could have been a great series. It's hard to have fun playing a game where you have to sit still to have any remote chance of hitting your target. Now, I'm willing to grant, the hitboxes in Turok 2 can be a bit wonky, especially on bosses where you're aiming for antenna or a specific arm, but they're not so bad as to require you to stop. Turok is fast-paced, and you can absolutely move and shoot at the same time. I would argue that the slightly off hitboxes in Turok can be mitigated by the extreme power a good headshot will give you. I mean, headshots in this game can make certain enemies go from needing 5 to 8 shots to take out, to killing them in a single bullet. So perhaps having an artificial limit on them makes sense. I can get that it isn't always satisfying when those good shots don't line up, but it's definitely not a big enough issue to warrant giving the game a 2 out of 10. The only place I found aiming to be particularly bad was in the Hive of the Mantids, and that's really just because bug heads are smaller than dinosaur heads. At the end of the day, Turok is a pretty easy game. I've beaten this on an N64 controller, Xbox controller, and most recently a mouse and keyboard, and never once have I felt the game to be particularly unforgiving. There's lots of ammo. Don't be afraid to spray and pray down some of those enemies. Turok 2 is, in my opinion, the best game in the series. It took the wonderfully frantic and fast combat from the original and beefed up the gameplay and story to match. It would have been easy for Iguana Entertainment to just copy-paste its successful formula from the first game and make another run-and-gun platformer shooter. Instead, they added tons of new gameplay ideas with powers, puzzle solving, quests, new weapons, and more. The title of this video was meant to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, but this game is literally a Metroidvania in a very limited capacity. Iguana Entertainment didn't have to make that happen, but I'm very glad that they did. On top of that, they not only kicked the story elements into next gear, they also did some of the best sequel baiting on the history of the console. Where the original Turok played as a great and memorable shooter, it was mostly self-contained and the story existed in comics that most players wouldn't even really know existed. As much as it was badass to watch Talset flex after killing a laser T-Rex, it didn't really add much to my immersion in the world. Turok 2 stands on its own as a truly memorable narrative experience. and even now knowing how the series ends has managed to hype me up to play the third game, Shadow of Oblivion. Whether you are a long-standing fan of the series, or someone who's never touched a Turok game in their life, do yourself a favor and give this one a playthrough in its new remastered edition. It'll only cost you a few hours of your life, and it will be an experience you will not soon forget. See you in the next video.